Every single night, the most powerful creatures in the kingdom escaped their golden cages. The royal guards panicked. The dragon tamers failed. The king's best knights couldn't stop it. But every single morning, those same dragons were found in the same place. Curled up, fast asleep, on the lap of a man nobody ever noticed. Not a knight, not a wizard, not a prince, a janitor. And the royals, they were furious, because they couldn't explain it. They couldn't control it. And deep down, they were terrified of what it meant. Tonight, you are going to discover 3 things that will completely change how you see power, worth, and what it truly means to be chosen. First, why dragons, the most dangerous creatures alive, refuse to trust anyone with a title. Second, the ancient secret hidden inside the janitor that nobody in the palace could see. Third, what happened when the king finally tried to remove him. The answer will shock you. Let me show you exactly how this happened. His name was Edric. Nobody knew his last name. Nobody asked. In the royal palace of Oldenmore, janitors didn't have last names that mattered. They had mops. They had buckets. They had long, quiet hallways to sweep while the important people walked past without looking down. Edric was 53 years old. His hair had gone silver sometime in his 40s, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had seen hard things and decided to be gentle anyway. He wore the same gray uniform every day. He ate alone in the back corner of the kitchen. He never complained. He never asked for anything. Most of the palace staff couldn't even tell you what color his eyes were. But the dragons knew. The Royal Dragon Nursery sat in the east wing of Oldenmore Palace, behind 3 locked iron doors, 2 enchanted barriers, and a full rotation of the kingdom's most decorated dragon handlers. It was considered the most secure room in all the land. Baby dragons, called hatchlings, were the most prized possession of the royal bloodline. Each one was worth more than 10 villages. Each one was destined for a royal rider. And each one was watched around the clock from the moment they cracked their shells. There were 4 of them that season. The eldest, and most powerful, was a crimson hatchling the royal family had named Soren. He was bigger than the others, with scales that shimmered between deep red and burning gold, depending on the light. His eyes were orange, like embers that never quite died out. From the very first day, the head dragon handler, a proud man named Lord Castle, had declared Soren would bond with Prince Aldrich, the king's only son. That was the plan. Dragons don't care about plans. The first night Soren escaped, everyone assumed it was a fluke. The enchanted barrier had a crack. They said, a handler left a door slightly unlatched. They said, they fixed it. They tightened every lock. They added 2 more guards. Soren escaped again the next night. And this time, he brought his sister. The handlers found them the next morning in the east hallway, curled up together on the stone floor near the supply closet. Asleep. Completely, deeply, peacefully asleep. Their wings folded, their little horns glowing faintly, their breathing slow and even. Standing above them with a mop, looking equally confused, was Edric. He told the guards he had just found them there. He said he didn't know how they got out. He said he hoped he wasn't in trouble. Lord Castle was furious. He swept in, scooped up the hatchlings, who immediately woke up shrieking and snapping, and personally escorted them back to the nursery. He tripled the enchantments. He stationed guard directly inside the room. He threatened every single handler with dismissal if it happened again. It happened again. Night 3. All 4 hatchlings this time. And again they were found in the east hallway. And again they were curled up near that supply closet. And again, Edric was standing nearby, mop in hand, looking like a man who very much wished he was somewhere else. This time, Lord Castle didn't just take the dragons back. He stood there for a long moment. He looked at Edric. He looked at the hatchlings, all four of them now awake. All four of them pressed against Edric's legs. All four of them making a low humming sound that experienced handlers recognized as the dragon equivalent of a purr. That sound was significant. Dragon handlers trained for years, sometimes decades, to earn that sound from a hatchling. It meant deep trust. It meant safety. It meant the dragon had decided, on its own, in the deepest instinctive part of its ancient nature, that this person was safe. These four hatchlings, who had never once made that sound for Lord Castle, or for Prince Aldrich, or for the king himself, were making it for a janitor. Lord Castle turned around and walked straight to the king's chambers. Because this was no longer a security problem. This was something else entirely. King Marin III was not a patient man. He had built his entire reign on control. Control of his borders. Control of his treasury. Control of the dragon bloodline that had kept his family in power for 6 generations. The dragons of Aldenmore were not just creatures. They were symbols. Every royal rider who bonded with a dragon became something more than human in the eyes of the people. They became chosen. They became legend. And the king had spent 15 years preparing his son Aldrich to be the greatest dragon rider the kingdom had ever seen. So when Lord Castle walked into his chamber at dawn and told him that 4 royal hatchlings had chosen a janitor over his son, King Marin did not take it well. He walked to the nursery himself. He watched. He waited. He brought Prince Aldrich with him. The young prince was 17. Tall, trained, serious-faced. He had read every book on dragon bonding. He had practiced the breathing techniques, the approach postures, the trust-building rituals that handlers used for years. He stepped into the nursery with quiet confidence. Soren looked at him, then looked away. Not fear, not aggression, just complete, total disinterest, like the prince was furniture. The king's jaw tightened. Then, through the nursery window, Edric walked past in the corridor below, pushing his cleaning cart. He was humming quietly to himself. He didn't even look up. All 4 hatchlings went to the window. Every single one. They pressed their small snouts against the glass. Their tails started moving. That humming sound filled the room again, soft and warm and completely involuntary, like breathing. Prince Aldrich stood in the center of the room, surrounded by royal dragons, who were ignoring him completely to stare at a janitor through a window. It was perhaps the most humiliating moment in the history of the Aldenmore royal line. The king ordered Edric brought to him immediately. Edric arrived still holding his mop, because nobody had told him to put it down. He stood in the throne room, looking deeply uncomfortable. He was the kind of man who had spent his entire life trying not to be noticed, and now he was standing in front of a king, with an expression that suggested he was trying to calculate how badly this was going to go. King Marin studied him for a long time. He asked Edric what he was doing to the dragons. Edric said he wasn't doing anything. The king asked how the dragons kept getting to him. Edric said he honestly didn't know. The king asked if Edric had used magic, or an enchantment, or some kind of bait. Edric said, very quietly, that he didn't know any magic, had no enchantments, and that the only thing he ever gave the hatchlings was a little warmth when they found him in the hallway at night, because they were small and they seemed cold and he felt bad for them. The king stared at him. Edric added that he hoped that wasn't against the rules. King Marin dismissed him without another word. He then turned to Lord Castle and told him to find an explanation. There had to be a bloodline connection, a hidden magical ability, something, because the alternative, that 4 royal dragons had simply chosen this man because he was kind, was not an explanation the king was willing to accept. Lord Castle bowed and said he would investigate immediately. What he found would shake the palace to its foundation. Because when the royal archivists pulled Edric's records, routine, they said, just a background check, they didn't find nothing. They found something that should have been impossible. Buried in a registry, so old the pages had gone yellow and brittle at the edges, under a family name that had been deliberately crossed out and rewritten with a common worker designation, was a lineage that nobody in that palace was prepared to find. Edric wasn't just a janitor. He was the last living heir of the Drakenfeld bloodline, the family the king's own grandfather had destroyed. The Drakenfeld name had not been spoken aloud in Aldenmoor for 30 years. Not in the court, not in the history books taught to noble children, not in the old songs the tavern singers performed for coins. The name had been carefully, deliberately, systematically removed from every record the royal family could reach. But you cannot remove a bloodline. The Drakenfelds had been the original dragon-bonded family of Aldenmoor. Not the Marins, not the royals who sat on the throne now. Before any of that, it was the Drakenfelds who had first earned the trust of the great dragons. They had not done it through force or magic or careful training protocols. They had done it through something that the current royal court had forgotten was even a real thing. They had done it through genuine connection. Ancient texts, the ones that survived, the ones the palace had not managed to burn, described the Drakenfeld bond as something that could not be faked or learned. Dragons, according to those texts, could sense the emotional interior of a human being the way other animals sense smell or sound. They didn't hear your title. They didn't see your armor or your crown. They felt your truth. They felt whether you were safe, whether you were still, whether the deepest part of you was honest. And for generations, the Drakenfelds had been exactly that. Then King Marin's grandfather had decided he wanted the dragons for himself. The war was short. The Drakenfelds were not warriors. They were bonded writers, scholars, keepers of the old ways. They had no army. They had no political allies. They had dragons, but they refused to use them as weapons against people, even in their own defense. That restraint, that fundamental, unbreakable principle, was what made them who they were. It was also what got them killed. Almost all of them. One survived. A young boy, 7 years old at the time, hidden by a loyal servant in a wagon headed south. Given a new name, given a new history, raised in a small village far from the palace, with no knowledge of who he really was. That boy grew up. He moved around. He took simple jobs. He ended up, by a series of small, unremarkable decisions, working in the very palace his family had once ruled. And he had no idea. Edric had grown up with no memory of his real name. No knowledge of his bloodline. No sense of anything special about himself at all. He was just a quiet man who liked his work well enough, who never felt comfortable around loud or powerful people, and who had always, without knowing why, felt a strange sense of peace around animals. Dogs would come to him in the street. Birds landed near him without fear. Horses that threw other riders went calm under his hands. He had always assumed he was just lucky with animals. He wasn't lucky. He was Drakenfeld, and the hatchlings knew it before he did. When Lord Castle brought this information to the king, the room went very quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. The kind that presses against your chest. King Marin sat with it for a long time. Then he asked one question. Does Edric know? Lord Castle said no. According to everything they could determine, Edric had never been told. The servant who hid him had died years ago. The trail was cold. As far as Edric was concerned, he was nobody. The king nodded slowly. Then he said something that Lord Castle would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "Keep it that way." He ordered the file sealed. He ordered Lord Castle to silence on the matter. He ordered that Edric be quietly transferred to a different part of the palace, far from the nursery, with a small raise in pay and a simple explanation that his cleaning zone had been reassigned. It was clean. It was quiet. It should have worked. But nobody told the dragons. The hatchlings stopped eating. It started 2 days after Edric was reassigned to the West Wing. At first, the handlers thought it was a phase. Hatchlings went through moody periods. It was normal. They adjusted feeding schedules. They tried different meats. They brought in warmer lighting and softer bedding. They played recordings of the low humming sounds that experienced bonded dragons made. Nothing worked. By the 4th day, Soren hadn't eaten at all. His scales, which had shimmered gold and crimson in the nursery light, had gone dull. He sat in the corner of his enclosure with his wings folded flat and his orange eyes half closed. The other 3 followed his lead, huddled together in silence, making no sound. The royal physician was called. He examined them carefully. He checked their temperatures, their scales, the clarity of their eyes. He consulted every dragon medical text available in the royal library. His conclusion was simple and devastating. They were grieving. Not sick. Not poisoned. Not physically failing. Grieving. Because dragons, unlike the humans who kept them, did not simply accept a bond being taken away. When a dragon chose a person, truly chose them, with that deep, instinctive, ancient certainty, the connection was not decorative. It was biological. It was woven into the dragon's nervous system like a thread. Remove the person, and you didn't just remove comfort. You removed something that felt, to the dragon, like a part of itself. Prince Aldrich heard this report, and for the first time in his young life, he felt something other than entitlement when he looked at the hatchlings. He felt shame. He went to his father that night. He told the king what he had heard. He told him that Soren was dying slowly, not from any wound or illness, but from the simple fact of being separated from someone who had not done anything wrong. The king listened. He did not respond immediately. Aldrich then said something unexpected. He said that he had been thinking about what it meant to be chosen. He had spent his whole life being told he was special because of his blood, his training, his destiny. And yet those 4 dragons, creatures whose instincts were older than the kingdom itself, had looked at all of that and looked away, and had chosen a man who asked for nothing. He said he thought maybe the dragons were smarter than the court. King Marin looked at his son for a long time. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked to the window. Outside, in the west courtyard, a single figure was sweeping the cobblestones in the late afternoon light. Methodical, unhurried, a man at complete peace with his own invisibility. A man who had no idea that the entire future of the kingdom's dragon line was sitting in a nursery, going quiet because he was not there. The king watched him for almost a full minute. When he turned back to Aldrich, something in his face had shifted. Not surrender. Something harder than that. Something that looked, just barely, like honesty. He asked Aldrich one thing. If you knew this man was your equal, maybe more than your equal, could you accept that? Aldrich didn't hesitate. He said yes. The king was quiet again. Then he called for Lord Castle. What happened in the next hour would be told in every corner of Aldenmoor for generations. Lord Castle walked to the west courtyard himself. He found Edric sweeping near the old fountain. He stood in front of him and, for the first time in the history of the palace, the lord of the royal court bowed to a janitor. Then he told Edric the truth. All of it. The Drakenfeld name, the bloodline, the hatchlings, the file, the king's original order to keep him away. Edric stood very still, His mop handle rested against the fountain. His gray uniform caught the last of the afternoon light. And the man who had spent his entire life being walked past, looked through, and never once asked about, finally heard his own name. His real one. Edric did not cry. He stood beside that old stone fountain for a long time after Lord Castle finished speaking. The courtyard was empty except for the two of them, and the sound of the wind moving through the castle banners above. Castle waited. He wasn't sure what he expected. Anger, maybe. Grief. Shock. What he got was quiet. Edric picked up his mop. He leaned it carefully against the wall. He straightened his gray uniform. Then he looked at Lord Castle with those calm, unremarkable eyes that nobody in the palace had ever looked at closely enough. And he asked one question. How are the hatchlings doing? Castle told him. Edric nodded slowly. He asked if he could go see them. Castle said yes. They walked together through the east corridor, past the great tapestries and the marble floors, and the suits of ceremonial armor that lined the royal halls. Edric walked the way he always walked, quietly, close to the wall, not taking up more space than he needed. Castle noticed, perhaps for the first time, the particular kind of dignity in that walk. Not smallness, not defeat, just a man completely at peace with exactly where his feet were. When the nursery doors opened, the change was immediate. All four hatchlings were on their feet before Edric crossed the threshold. Soren lifted his head. His dull scales caught the light and, slowly, like embers being breathed back to life, began to glow. The crimson deepened. The gold threads across his wings brightened. He made that sound, that deep, resonant, ancient hum, and the other three joined him, filling the room with something that felt less like a sound and more like feeling. Edric walked to the center of the room and sat down on the stone floor. No ceremony, no command, no formal bonding ritual. He just sat down, and Soren walked over and laid his enormous head across Edric's lap. The others followed, one by each shoulder, one curled at his side, all four of them settling around this quiet, silver-haired man in a gray janitor's uniform, as if the entire world outside those walls had simply stopped mattering. King Marin was watching from the doorway. Nobody had told him to come. He had come anyway. He stood there in his royal robes, the most powerful man in the kingdom, and he watched a scene that no amount of wealth or title or military power had been able to create. He watched his dragons finally rest. Aldrich stood beside his father. He said nothing, but after a long moment, he walked into the nursery and sat down near Edric. Not commanding, not presenting himself as a rider or a prince. Just sitting, being present. Soren opened one orange eye and regarded him. Then, slowly, he stretched one wing and let it rest across the prince's knee. Not chosen, not bonded, not the grand destiny story that the royal court had planned, but something real, something the dragons permitted, a beginning built on honesty rather than expectation. Edric looked at the prince and nodded once. Aldrich nodded back. And in that room, on that afternoon, without a single declaration or ceremony or royal announcement, the old ways of the Drakenfeld bloodline came back to Aldenmore. Not as a conquest, not as revenge, as a quiet, unhurried return, the way truth always returns when you stop trying to bury it. Edric never moved into the royal chambers. He didn't want to. He moved into a small room near the nursery, still close to the east hallway where it all began. He still woke early. He still kept things clean and ordered. He still walked close to the wall. But he was no longer invisible. The dragons made sure of that. Every morning, when the palace came to life, and the corridors filled with nobles and knights and servants, There was always at least one crimson hatchling following a silver-haired man down the hall. And everyone, from the lowest kitchen worker to the highest lord, learned very quickly to step aside. Not because they were told to, because some things earn respect without ever asking for it. Here is the thing nobody talks about. The king never publicly admitted what he had done. He never announced Edric's true name to the kingdom. He never held a ceremony. There was no grand restoration of the Drakenfeld title. But he never removed Edric from the palace either. And every dragon born in Aldenmore after that year, every single one, was brought to Edric first. Before the handlers, before the royal riders, before anyone with a title or a plan. Just to see. Just to let the dragon decide. Because the king had finally learned the one lesson that 6 generations of his family had refused to accept. You cannot choose who the dragons choose. And maybe, just maybe, the dragons were never wrong. If this story opened your eyes to what real worth looks like, stay with me, because the next story is going to hit even harder. So let's bring this together. Edric spent his entire life being overlooked. No title, no power, no recognition. And yet the most ancient, instinctive creatures in the kingdom found him every single night because he offered the one thing that cannot be faked. Truth, stillness, genuine care. The royals had everything. Training, magic, wealth, bloodlines, and still the dragons walked past all of it to find a man with a mop. That is not just a fantasy story. That is something real. If you felt something watching this, if this story hit you in a way you didn't expect, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to hear stories like this one. Subscribe so you never miss a new HFY story. We post every week, and every story is built to stay with you. And watch this next video right here. It is another story about an overlooked human who changes everything, and I promise you, the ending will leave you completely speechless. Before you go, one question for the comments. ***, who in your real life reminds you of Edric? Someone who's worth the world keeps missing ***. Tell me below. I read every single one.